Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. In this video, let us learn about grids in CSS. So in the previous video, we covered about flexbox, which we know is used to lay out elements either in a row or in a column. Now we have something called as grids, which we can use to lay out the elements in both the rows and the columns. So let us learn about grids in this video. Now a very common application of grid can be the Instagram posts grid that you see on the profile page or any other image gallery. So each of the photos that we see on Instagram page can be assumed to be laid out on a grid. So like this. So if you are creating an image gallery, you can make some photos bigger than the other ones, but in the end all of them are laid inside this one grid. So let me explain the steps for defining a grid. All we need is a container first, on which we can set the display property to grid. And then we can make use of the grid template rows and the grid template columns properties to define the number and the size of the rows and columns. So to define a grid, let me first create a new folder 6.grid. And inside this folder, let us create a new file and name it as grid.html. So in here, let us quickly scaffold our basic HTML boilerplate. So type exclamation and press tab. Let us now create a CSS file and let us name it as grids.css. So right inside the grid folder, let us create a CSS file, grid.css. Also let us link the CSS file right here, grid.css. So let us first define a div with the class of container. And now let us define some styles for our container div right inside the grid.css file. So in here, let us target the div with the class of container. And first, let us set its display property to grid. Now let us say I want to create a grid with 4 rows and 3 columns. So let me help you in visualizing this. So we want a grid with 4 rows, so 1, 2, 3 and 4, and 3 columns, so 1, 2 and 3. So first let us use the grid template rows property to define the number and the size of the rows that we want. So let us say each of our rows should be 200 pixel in height. So grid template rows 200 pixel for the first row, 200 pixel for the second one, 200 pixel for the third one, and 200 pixel for the last one as well. Now you can use different units for these as well, but for now let us keep it simple and use the value of 200 pixel as the height of each row. So 200 pixel for the first row, 200 pixels for the second one, 200 for the third one, and 200 for the last one. Now similarly, we have the other property for defining the number and size of the columns. So we're gonna have 3 columns, each with a width of 100 pixels. So grid template columns 100 pixel for the first one, for the first column, 100 pixel for the second one, and 100 pixel for the last column. So 100 pixel for the first column, 100 for the second one, and 100 for the last one. Now to get a visual display of this container, let us give a border property to the container and set this to 3 pixels solid lime green. So let us give this a preview to see what we get. And now let us open the inspect tab. And here let us click on the layout tab. So here you can select different options to visualize the grid that was created. So here click on grid. So here we can check mark the option show track sizes, and it will show you the size of each of the rows and the columns. Now here above we are having the same value for each of our row and column sizes, so we can make it better by removing this duplicacy. So let us use the repeat function, which takes two arguments. So repeat, the first one is the number of rows and columns that you want, and the second one is the size of each row or column that you want. So here we want 4 rows, and the size for each row should be 200 pixels. And here we want 3 columns, so repeat 3, and each column should have a size of 100 pixels. With this we can easily change the number and size of each row or column if we later decide to change them. So next, let us go right inside our HTML file and create 5 boxes. So in here, let us create 5 boxes, each with the class of element. And let us label each of the boxes with the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Now let us head over to our grid.css file and define some styles for these elements to make them appear like a box. So right here, let us give each div with the class of element a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of maroon. So let us give this a preview to see what we get. So you can see these items are automatically placed from top left to bottom right, but we have full control regarding the placement of these items, which we will see in just a minute. So here you can see each of our grid item is taking the entire width of the cell in which it is present, but half the entire height of the cell. Now in grids, to align the items along the horizontal axis, we can make use of the justify items property, and to align the items along the vertical axis, we can make use of the align items property. Now we have a couple of values that we can make use of for these properties, but for now let us set both of these properties to center. So go right at the top on the container element and let us set these properties to center. So justify items center, align items center, and then give it a preview. With this in place, you can see each div with the class of element is now in the center of its containing cell. Now have a look at this grid. This grid is currently aligned to the left side of the container. We have 2 extra properties that we can use for aligning the grid inside the container. So we have the justify content property, which we can set to start, center, end, and so on. So let us set this to center. So you can see that our grid is now horizontally centered. We also have align content, which is used for vertical alignment. So let us set this to center, align content center, and give this a preview in the browser, and you can see this gives no effect. There is no extra vertical spacing available inside the container. Now to add some space at the top and bottom, let us set some height for our container. Let us set the height property for the container and set this to 1000 pixels. So our grid, as you can see now, is perfectly aligned to the center. Now we don't need to align this grid as a complete unit. So let me comment the justify content and align content properties and then give this a preview. Next, let us say we want the first column, which is this one, to take 25% of the total space, the second column to take 30% of the total space, and then the last column to take remaining 45% of the total space. So for grid template columns, we can set this to, let me comment this first. So here we can say grid template columns. For the first column, we want 25% of the total space. For second, 30% of the total space, and for the last one, 45% of the total space. So you can see that the first column takes 25% of the total space now. The second column takes 30% of the total space, and the last column takes 45% of the total space. But using percentages is not recommended, because if let us say we have another column with say 200 pixel width, so let me add here 200 pixels. Did you see what happened? Our grid has now grown larger than the container because percentages that we are using here is based on the net width of the container. But what we need here is the percentage with respect to the available remaining space and not relative to total width of the container. So after allocation of 200 pixels for the first column, we have some free space left in the container. So here for the second column, we want 25% of the remaining space, right? And not 25% of the total space of the container. And same for the remaining two columns as well. Okay, so that is where we can make use of another unit, that is FR, which is short for fraction, which simply means a fraction of the available remaining space. So let us change the percentages to fractions. So here set this to FR, 25 FR, 30 FR and 45 FR. So as a best practice, it is recommended to use fractions over percentages while setting sizes of rows or columns for our grids. So this is how it looks at the moment. Now let us talk about placing items in a grid. For this, we have two properties, the grid row and the grid column. By setting these properties on the item, we can control where exactly that item should be placed. Let us say we want the first item to take the entire first row. So let us go to our markup and give the first item an extra class like element -1. So now let us target the first item, so element -1, and set the grid column property to 2. So grid column, and set this to a value of 2. So let us give this a preview, and you can see with this the first item moved to the second column, and as a result we get an empty cell in the first column. So let us make our first item to start at line 1 and the line at which we want to end, which is 5, which is this one. So here we need to again make use of the grid column property, and here we need to specify the line at which we want to start, which is 1, and the line at which we want to end, which is 5. So /5. So let us give this a preview, and now you can see our first item takes up the entire first row, and all the other items are now shifted to the second row, right? Now similarly we have another property that we can make use of called as the grid row property. So let us move our first item to the second row. So for this we just need to set the grid row property to 2, grid-row, and set this to a value of 2. So on giving this a preview, you can see that now our first item has shifted to the second row. Now similarly we can span the starting and the ending line number here as well, just as we did in case for grid column. So this was all I wanted to cover about the basics of grids. In the coming videos we will practice by creating layouts using flexbox and grids so as to solidify our concepts that we covered in these videos. So let's catch up in the very next one.